Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Angel and today I'm sharing some thrifted makeovers. For this first project, I found this cute little wood swan at my local thrift store. It just needed a little bit of TLC. It actually had a little bit of its beak broken off. So that's the first thing I'm gonna do is just fix that with a little bit of spackling. And then I just let that dry for a few hours before giving it a nice sanding with some fine grit sandpaper. And then I just gave it a nice cleaning with some soap and water. Now I wanted to pretty this swan up a little bit, so I'm pulling out this flower mold that I got from Amazon and using some of my air dry clay, and I'm just going to press this into my mold and make that little flower piece. Then I used some Gorilla Glue to kind of shape this around the neck part and down into the body, and I'm just gluing the outside to this, and like I said, just shaping that around that neck part a little bit so that it looks like one piece. I let the glue dry for a few hours and then went back in with 2 coats of my Waverly white chalk paint and covered the entire piece, including that rose mold. And once those 2 coats were dry, I'm going back in with a smaller brush and some of my black chalk paint to repaint the beak and the eye area. And finally, for this little swan, I just went in with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and brushed it over her beak. For this next project, I found this cute little oval frame from my thrift store. Now, if you're like me, it's kind of hard to find oval or round frames. So when I found this one, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. So I started by taking that back piece apart, and I had planned on using some of my basswood to make a background for this. But luckily, once I took this apart, I was pleasantly surprised to find that there was already a wood piece in the back of it. But if you don't have a frame that already has a backing, then I have some basswood linked below in my Amazon store that is super easy to cut down. So I just started by removing that glass piece, and then I popped the wood piece back down in there and closed it back up. Then I went in with 2 coats of my plaster chalk paint and painted this entire frame and the backing piece. And honestly, I think this project would be really pretty in any different kind of spring color, pink, blue, green. I think they would all turn out beautiful. So I wanted to make a 3D butterfly kind of art piece for this. So I'm using this little butterfly mold that I got from Amazon, and I'm just making a ton of little butterflies with my air dry clay. And once I made a whole bunch of these little butterflies, I started by gluing a larger one to the outside of my frame and then just kind of glued them going in a diagonal direction across this entire frame, so it kind of looked like the butterflies were coming out of it. And as I moved upward across the frame, I decided to lift some of the butterfly wings. Now, if your clay is still really wet, you may want to let these butterflies dry for just a little bit so that when you shape those wings, they'll stay in place. I waited about 24 hours for my butterflies to dry, and then I went over them with that same paint color I used on the frame. I may or may not be on a huge clock kick right now, but I actually did need a new clock for my dining room. So I found this one at my thrift store for a few dollars. And the first thing I did was just take everything apart because both the bottom and the top piece came out, but the glass didn't come out. So I actually just cut down a thin piece of cardboard to cover up that glass before giving this 3 coats of my white chalk paint. And while that was drying, I'm moving on to that clock face. Now, at first, I was just going to make a completely new clock face by just printing one off, but those handles do not come off of here. They were actually either super glued or really bonded. There was no way to get the clock piece off of there. So I decided I was just going to paint this entire face with some of my plaster chalk paint, and I just kind of moved the clock hands around as I was painting it, and I ended up doing just 2 coats to cover everything. And when I did the second coat, I actually just kind of dabbed the paint all over it to give it a little bit of texture. Then I wanted to add back in the numbers, so I'm just using these stamps that I got from Amazon and some of my archival ink, and I'm going around and doing all the numbers. And again, just to kind of make sure that I was putting the numbers in the right place, I just moved those handles around as I was doing it. Then to dull down those gold handles on the clock, I just added some of my European gold rub and buff and just used a napkin underneath them to make sure it didn't transfer. Then moving back to the actual clock piece, on that bottom part where it had that spring picture that I took out, I am going to do a stencil on the back of this, and I'm using a damask stencil that I got from Amazon, and then I'm using the color plaster in my chalk paint to do this. It's just a few shades darker than my white paint, so it's not going to be super noticeable, but it will give a little bit of detail. And this is the same color that I used on the face of the clock, so I thought this would go well with that. So all I had to do was just kind of move my stencil around and match up the pattern to do this complete backside. And since I'm going to be leaving this backside open now without a picture in it, I'm using some of these Dollar Tree plant hangers, and I just broke that apart into a little piece that I could hang from this. And I did use some of my European gold rub and buff to bronze this up a little bit so that it's not black anymore. But I'm just going to take apart the little piece right there to where I want it to hang, and I'm actually going to use one of these clock molds that I got from Amazon to make a little hanger for this. So I just used some of my air dry clay, pressed it down in there, and made the mold for this. Now I did end up going ahead and poking the hole through the top of this. Then I was able to slip in that piece of chain that I had, and I let this dry just like this with the piece inside of it so that it didn't dry in a weird way or the hole didn't close up. Then I'm using one of these little eye hooks, and I screwed that right into the center so that I could hang my timepiece from it. But before I hung it, once it was dry, I did use my European gold rub and buff to make this into a bronzy gold color. Then all I had to do was just use some pliers to remove a few pieces of that chain so that I could make it fit nicely in here with the little timepiece that I made. Then I just attached the timepiece and tightened it with some pliers. For this final project, I picked up this little stool from my thrift store. I believe I got this for $3, which is great because I was actually looking for a stool to go in my dining room with a little rocking chair that I have in there. So I thought I could definitely upcycle this and make it more into my style and to go with the rest of my decor and my furniture. Now, the first thing I did was just go ahead and remove that top piece from the bottom piece because we're going to be painting this top piece. Now, I could have recovered this top piece, but since it's not really going to be used much, it's more just for decor. And like I said, it's going to be in my dining room. So I thought I could just paint over this because I actually did like the pattern. Now you can see I'm mixing up a little bit of acrylic paint and some chalk paint. I also added about a half a cup of fabric softener to this mixture. And then for mine, since I did like the pattern and I actually wanted some of that green color to show through, I just added a little bit of water to my mixture as well. And as you can see, while I'm doing this first coat, it is actually just kind of whitewashing this fabric. If you wanted to actually do full coverage, just leave out the water. Once that first coat was completely dry, I went back in with a second coat of the same mixture. I don't have the exact measurements. I just kind of eyeballed it, but I just mixed the paint, the fabric softener, and the water until I was happy with the consistency. And once I had that second coat on, I set this aside to dry for 24 hours. Then I moved back to the base part, which I did take outside and give one coat of Rust-Oleum white spray paint before bringing this back in and giving it 2 more light coats of my white chalk paint. I let that completely dry and then I mixed up a nice brown color that I liked, and I'm gonna start painting this all over my piece, but I'm using a wet paintbrush to do this. Now you don't want your brush so wet that it is dripping like you see here. When I first started, my brush was a little too wet, so I do have to go back in and wipe that off. You just want your brush to be a little bit damp, and then you're gonna dip it in that paint and you're gonna brush over this entire exterior with that paint and just a little bit of water on your brush. You'll want to let the paint sit for a little while, and that's why I said go ahead and do the entire outside. Then you can go work your way around with a paper towel and wipe off the excess. Now you're going to notice that the first coat looks a little rough, and that's okay because after you wipe off the excess, you're going to go right back in with your damp paintbrush and do another coat. And you can continue doing as many coats as you want to darken this up to the color that you want. But this is going to end up giving you a nice natural wood look with different brush strokes and different color variations all throughout your piece. Now, once everything was dry, here I'm going back in on that top piece with a little bit of clear wax to seal everything in and make sure that none of that paint will transfer if this is used. Now, I have heard that Annie Sloan's soft wax is best for painted fabric, but all I had was the Waverly clear wax, so that's what I used for this project. And I'm gonna be super honest, once the wax is on here, this is soft to the touch, but it does feel a little bit kind of like leather or a similar fabric to that after you paint fabric. So I think using that soft wax, if this is going to be something that you are going to use often, would be a much better idea than using the Waverly. For the final touch to this footstool, I'm using these stencils that I got from Amazon, and I'm gonna mix up a little bit of Dollar Tree spackling with some of my metallic gold paint to create a raised stencil look on the bottom part of this footstool. So I'm just gonna mix that up and then tape down my stencils, and I'm gonna spread this all over the stencil, and then I will lift up that painter's tape and it will leave a raised stencil texture on there. Then I just cleaned off my stencil and flipped it over to do the other side. And for the centerpiece, I just used the larger stencil that came in this pack. After the spackling had dried for a few hours, to finish this off, I just went back in with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and brushed it over all of those raised stencils. Then all I had to do was just put this footstool back together. And that's going to be it for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed these projects. I'll see you next time.